I think the big theme of this podcast is like top Pacific stories, top China stories.
That's coming up in just a few moments. This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news commentary and analysis from the Asia Pacific region. China kind of cops up to hacking the United States. Could North Korea be planning another nuclear test? With the end of the year approaching, we take a look back at the year's top stories. Plus more from the region that you may have missed are all coming up next on the December 11th edition of Asia News Weekly. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friend. Steve Miller here. Thank you so much for joining me today, either on the website or in your favorite podcast application. You know what? Before we get started, I have a program note. You know, it's that time of year again, so this will be the last Asia News Weekly podcast for 2015. I'm about to go into finals week here at the university, and then I'll be leaving on vacation for the holidays throughout the month of January. But I will pick the podcast back up in February of 2016. But until then, there won't be anything new. So to keep up with more news from the region and, of course, my adventures in the United States and abroad, be sure to follow me on Twitter. You can find me at Steve Miller, ANW. All right, let's go ahead and get this party started. The cyber attack on the United States Office of Personnel Management, or the OPM, was nothing short of devastating and, quite frankly, a national embarrassment. In short, it should have never happened. Almost from day one, China, of course, was suspected as being the perpetrator, but Washington always held its tongue in naming Beijing as being the one responsible for the data breach. Earlier this year, U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies drew up a list of hackers the United States wanted arrested and tasked their counterparts in China to round them up. And Beijing did so. This past week, China has even gone one step further in saying the Chinese nationals were responsible for the cyber attack. A recent Xinhua News report said, through investigation, the case turned out to be a criminal case rather than a state-sponsored cyber attack, as the United States side has previously suspected. Come on now. When you're at home and you find a vase broken and you ask a child who did it, of course they're going to deny it. And this really is no different. China giving itself the all-clear is suspect because it is in Beijing's best interest to remain out of it. But as Bob Fanau, founder of RGI, says, it is going to be very hard to prove that China was behind things. In fact, previously on the podcast, Rand Corporation's Martin Libicki said that cyber espionage is something that everyone does, but there are some rules that guide behavior. Essentially, states can go after personal information, like what was gleaned in the OPM hack, but not intellectual property. The problem is that China likes to have its cake and eat it too. Even if Beijing wasn't directly behind the OPM hack, it will find a way to use the data, as we have seen it do in the past. Michael Raska, senior fellow at the Singapore-based Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, noted that China's victory parade a few months back was a bazaar of stolen intellectual property, citing several examples of tech pilfered from abroad. So it's clear that the state of China benefits from these cyber attacks. The cybersecurity breach on the OPM was a national security disaster, affecting millions of Americans with government ties. Past experience shows us that China will absolutely find a way to use the information to their advantage. Playing up the admission made by Beijing as some great thing is nothing more than spin, and something we shouldn't fall for. Nothing has changed with China, as we've seen by its actions in the South China Sea, and to believe so is naive and irresponsible. Coming up in a few minutes, NPR's Haydong Kang joins me to reminisce about the top stories of 2015. The Korean War ended in 1953, and since that time, there have been some skirmishes with the dictatorial state. However, in general, the armistice has held. So after all this time, shouldn't a peace treaty finally be formalized? North Korea has requested such a formal document be drawn up with the United States, but Washington turned that notion down. Doug Bandow, a Korea expert and senior fellow at the Cato Institute, believes that the United States should take Pyongyang up on its offer. He feels that this request may be genuine and that talking is better than the status quo, which benefits no one. Bandow says that when engaged in dialogue, the DPRK simply behaves better. Let's face it, the war is long over, and current North Korean engagement policies are completely ineffective and may actually perpetuate the regime as it legitimizes a perceived existential threat. But the North isn't the only one who benefits from the threat of war. South Korea also uses the war to clamp down on free speech, which can be seen in this past week in the indictment of a former professor for praising North Korea, which is in violation of the nation's national security law. Professor Kim had been researching North Korea's Juche policy since 2004 and possessed several prohibited documents, including a collection of Kim Jong-il's speeches. The NSL is a convenient excuse for Seoul to restrict discussions and scholarship on the DPRK. It is conceivable that if peace was finally established and a two-state solution achieved, both nations could prosper, and that is something that should be explored. But that isn't likely to happen anytime soon. Imagery dating back to October and early November confirmed that North Korea continues to excavate a tunnel near its nuclear testing facility. However, according to 38 North, a North Korean monitoring website run by Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., they've been monitoring this activity since April of 2015, and there are no signs of an imminent test despite the grave concerns that Seoul and Washington expressed earlier this month. Analysts do feel that North Korea has the capability to carry out a fourth test at any point in time. But if you'll remember, Rand Corporation's Bruce Bennett told Asia News Weekly that Kim Jong-un would most likely carry out a test when it was politically convenient for him. In 2013, when young Mr. Kim conducted that third nuclear test, he was new to his role and needed to solidify his position as a great leader. Pressing a big red shiny button and creating a huge explosion is certainly one way to do that. The test put him on the map, so to speak, and earned him a significant amount of political capital. But if we look at the world stage now, what benefit would a test give Kim? Once we're better able to ascertain and understand the political rewards of a nuclear test, we'll have a better idea of when one might actually take place. Coming up in the weekly brief, airstrips in the South China Sea, more support for Philippines in the International Court of Arbitration, Facebook posts land 2 Vietnamese students in jail, and more. With the final weeks of 2015 approaching and myself embarking on a vacation and placing the podcast on hiatus for about a month, I thought it fitting to take a look back over 2015 at some of the stories that helped shape the region. And to help me do that, I'd like to welcome Hae-Dun Kang from NPR's Seoul Bureau to the podcast. Hae-Dun, how you doing?
I'm doing good. It's a very sunny, beautiful day, and I'm having my cup of morning tea.
Excellent. So as the guest to the podcast, I'll let you go first. So on your list of top stories for 2015, what is the first one that comes to your mind?
Well, my criteria for choosing the top stories had to be the stories were not just region specific, and they had to be international, and they had to also be an ongoing issue. So they're still, relevant today. My top story was the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Oh, very good. So why did that make your list?
Well, it sets the rules for more than a third of the world's trade, and it's the world's largest free trade area, and it affects Asian countries who are not who haven't signed the treaty. Well, actually, the agreement hasn't been signed yet, but it affects Asian countries, but not only Asian countries, but repercussions around the world. Chile and Peru, Canada, Mexico, and the United States are about to sign it. It hasn't been signed yet, and it hasn't gone into effect, but it's in the works.
Well, right. And then you had the whole notion of several portions of the TPP being held closely guarded, top secret during the negotiations, and all the worries that other international parties would have. And then now you have other countries looking to join the TPP after the fact, once it goes under ratification as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue.
Right, definitely. And the full contents of the TPP, which were, protected very strictly, were just revealed in October. Mm-hmm. No, in November, was it?
Oh, a month or so ago, yeah.
Yes, not long ago. And it's a massive document. It's 6,000 pages. So people are still cracking the code.
Sifting through, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I have for I wouldn't say top story, but one of the ones that kind of segues from that, and that's tension and the disputes in the South China Sea, because that is the number one trade route, $5 trillion. So much so that because of the disputes, China didn't want that discussed at the recent APEC meeting, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting, but mainly because of the ratcheting up of tension through the area and the possible threats of freedom of navigation, which would impact trade and the TPP, really escalating this year, because we had that oil rig situation earlier in the year with China moving the oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and then the clashing of vessels there, the recent sailing of the Lawson through what China perceives as its territorial waters of a freedom of navigation exercise, and going to continue to do that at least once or possibly twice per quarter. Just a lot of things going on in the area. And it's going to be, something to continue to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and that was the second thing on my list as well. I agree that's a very important issue in the region. And I guess the heart of the conflict is, China is claiming what other countries claim as international waters to be its sovereign territory. And just China and the U.S. and other countries interpret the maritime law differently.
Well, yeah, and then you also come into the fact that, the case in question right now before The Hague, the Court of Arbitration with the Philippines, you have Italy coming out in support of the Philippines, Vietnam watching it very closely, and China from day one saying, hey, the Court of Arbitration does not have jurisdiction. We don't think this is a legitimate, case to be heard. And it brings up a lot of questions as to what Beijing will do once the court rules. Now, some of the things in the case have already gone in Beijing's favor, but it's also likely that a lot of things will also go in Manila's favor as well, and how that will impact the region, because even though China has said, hey, we're done reclaiming land, it really hasn't. It's continuing to build that up. There's at least one operational airstrip right now that can be used for military in the region. And I don't see that kind of tension ratcheting back in the next year or so.
So you don't think a military escalation is likely?
I think I had Rand Corporation experts Mark Kozat on the podcast. And one of the things I asked him is, do you think that we will see a military escalation? I think the general consensus is, and this is what I believe, is that the United States is too big to really have China go up against it in a military confrontation. But smaller nations like the Philippines, like Vietnam, or some other third party will try to do the same thing possibly that the United States is doing with freedom of navigation exercises. And then you could kind of see some kind of military skirmish like we have seen with Vietnam, with the Coast Guard vessels, with the oil rig. That I could possibly see, but not necessarily with the United States, because that would open up too much. And then if it were to do something with the Philippines because of the treaties in place with the United States, that also could be looked at as some form of deterrent. So possibly the way that Beijing would respond to a freedom of navigation exercise with Vietnam in the South China Sea may cause it to act differently with the Philippines, knowing that the United States is right behind it.
Well, I mean, the Philippines and the Vietnam are some of the nations that are most affected by this dispute, right? And they're trying to forge new alliances to counteract China's actions in the sea. And China's pretty adamant about building these islands. Like,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
piling up sand to, cover up a lot of acreage, like over the coral reefs. But the thing is, like, Asian countries are generally, I find that they're a little wary about, pissing China off. And in the East Asia Summit in ASEAN in Kuala Lumpur a few weeks ago, Philippines was, I think, the only vocal country, like, in terms of criticizing China.
Well, no, I agree with that. And I think a lot of it has to do is that a lot of these quote unquote developing countries are really dependent on Chinese trade and Chinese money. And essentially during the ASEAN Plus 3 summit, China said, okay, we're going to give money for development above and beyond that we've allocated for the AIIB, for the Asian Development Bank, for the BRICS Bank. We're going to give even more money. And it's specifically going to ASEAN countries that have competing territorial claims. So in my opinion, that's almost like hush money. If you want the development funds to keep on coming, you're not going to raise too much of a stink with the territorial disputes. And we saw no statement coming out of APEC, no statement coming out of ASEAN either. It's all about, everyone just chill and no one really taking China to task.
I mean, and going back to that military escalation, one of the biggest reasons that this dispute is causing concerns is because they think these waters are going to be militarized, right?
Oh, I think that's such a safe assessment. It doesn't even need to be postulated anymore.
Right. It's not even a hypothesis. Although the Chinese government is pretty opaque about its plans, so it's not like, explicitly saying that we're going to use these airstrips for, offensive purposes. They're saying it's just for defensive purposes.
And for assistance in, natural disaster relief. And no, I don't think really anyone buys that, but, that's their line. All right. Moving forward, before we eat up too much time, what is the next thing on your list?
Well, the third thing also concerns China. My bureau chief, Elise Hu, she once said that it would just be interesting if journalists had China beat as their, main stories, like how China is affecting Korea, Japan, and other neighboring countries. That would just be a beat in and of itself. But anyway, my third top story is smog.
Ooh, the pollution.
Yeah, air pollution knows no borders.
Yeah, we've seen that with the transboundary fires coming out of Indonesia as well, because that's certainly affected Southeast Asia humongously this year.
Yeah, so last week Beijing's like PM 2.5 air quality index soared over the 500 mark, which is like forest fire range. It's like intense. And this week, Beijing said that starting Tuesday, it's going to go back to the orange alert, which is the second highest level of air pollution.
And keep kids out of school as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, just to give some context of the air quality index of PM 2.5, right now in Seoul, it's about 60, which is normal. It's not that great. But China was 500. How can you live?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see the numbers and it just boggles your mind. I mean, this story didn't make my list because I was debating whether or not to put pollution on there and tie that in with the transboundary fires, because that is just tremendously bad, with people talking 3 years to kind of clean things up in that region. But the thing with the Chinese pollution that always gets me is that when they have like the G20 summit or they have the Olympics, they have a mechanism in place to turn all this stuff off and get that Beijing blue sky. And and you have them at the climate talks this week, or last week rather, saying, this isn't just a first world problem. This isn't a second world problem. This isn't a developing nation problem. Everyone needs to do its part. And then they kind of skirt over the fact that, hey, we're one of the biggest contributors to regional pollution.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's funny that you mentioned like Beijing's blue skies because I've been to Beijing twice in my life and both times it's only been clear. And this is why. In 2008, it was the Beijing Olympics. And recently, a few months ago, it was a Chinese military parade anniversary. So they just shut down factories momentarily in the nearby areas and regulated traffic. So it was crystal clear.
Yeah, so they have the mechanisms in place. The other sad thing about China is that up in Xinjiang, they have these huge wind farms, right? And so much of the power that they could be generating isn't translated to transferred to other areas because they don't have the electrical infrastructure in place. So they could actually make use of a whole bunch of alternative types of energy, but they don't put the infrastructure in there to support it.
Yeah. I mean, another reason why I chose smog and air pollution was because this year an important documentary was released in February, and it's called Under the Dome. And an investigative journalist, Chai Jing in China, she made this documentary in this kind of what's that Al Gore documentary?
Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah, in an Inconvenient Truth style documentary. And she was criticizing like the lack of regulations and the enforcement in this whole environmental situation. And also the total lack of teeth that the environmental agency has and the different interest groups that are like preventing China from actually, taking substantial steps in environmental improvement. And one case in point was she asked a provincial official why coal burning factories can't be shut down. And he answered, it just doesn't work to sacrifice employment for the environment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this documentary received hundreds of millions of views in China before it was banned. Now it's censored. But, it's just a turning point in the way Chinese people are starting to talk about the issue.
Yeah, no, anyone who has not seen it should really check it out because there are a lot of time-lapse sequences, and that is just amazing how you can see the pollution roll in, roll out, and whatnot. It's staggering to think of what people must go through when living there. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, on one of my lists, this was something that was big in East Asia, was the trilateral and then bilateral meeting between Shinzo Abe, PAC, and Xi Jinping. Well, not Xi Jinping, but Prime Minister Li, and the first meeting of those three leaders in the region, and for me, the whole meeting itself was a letdown. Well, because I had zero expectations, and those were achieved. But for me, it really showed the skill of Abe's international politicking to get the meetings with China, with Seoul, without having to give up anything. Mm-hmm. And those were two things he wanted to have during his term as Prime Minister of Japan. And it really shows that for all the talk of Beijing and Seoul, that when it comes to Japan and specifically historical issues, they just aren't making any headway at all.
Yeah. I mean, in that way, I just thought the trilateral summit was just symbolic, but I don't see anything more substantial than that because yeah.
No, go ahead.
I mean, at the heart of the issue, like what China and Korea was, going on about was the historical issue. But was that effectively addressed? Not really.
Well, no. And to me, you had going back further in a year when Abe met with Xi on the sidelines of various summits, the whole issue was, we will meet with Abe if he acknowledges that there's a dispute over the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. And his statement was, well, we recognize that you have a different opinion. And that was all that China needed to have, a meeting. So again, Abe wins on that point because he doesn't really say what China wants him to say. And then with PAC, her stance from day one was, I will not meet with Abe, unless Japan takes a more conciliatory tone with historical issues. And, Abe and the LDP haven't done that. And now she essentially backtracked on that as well. So he got his bilateral meeting without having to give up anything. And it makes PAC continue to look ineffective with international diplomatic matters with Japan.
Yeah. So if we if you don't mind moving on to the next issue. One thing we haven't talked about that's very close to our hearts and our bodies is the MERS issue.
That was on my list as well, yeah.
I was a little iffy about, I was kind of skeptical about choosing this as the top story in the Pacific region because, like, was it a real threat to the region?
Well, I tied it in with Ebola as well. Basically, infectious diseases of 2015. Because if you go back earlier in the year and the way that Asian countries were taking a look at restricting travel to other countries because of Ebola and then because of MERS, it really showed the fragility of international healthcare and what could happen if, if there was truly a dangerous infectious disease. Because with Ebola, with MERS, the chances of actually getting it were so low. But if it was a true airborne contagion, then it would be devastating.
So you mean that it's not the, whether it poses actual threat that matters, but the fact that, the news itself put a lot of countries on alert.
It put a lot of countries on alert. And specifically, if we take a look at South Korea, it really felt the impact on the tourism side of things, because over 60% of South Korea's tourism revenue and tourism visitors are from Chinese countries, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. And when those countries put the travel restrictions or travel warnings out against going to South Korea because of MERS, the industry in South Korea took a 1 billion won hit for a few months. And that really shows what a dangerous contagion situation could have on a country. If you look at Ebola and MERS from a regional perspective, you saw that addressed at WHO meetings in Manila. And with Ebola, they had some really interesting things come out about travel patterns, is that you could conceivably mark travelers as they go from one place to another. But if they go through a major hub like Hong Kong or Singapore, there's no telling if you'd really be able to track where they go to after that. And if it's a really dangerous airborne contagion, then that could really quickly spread throughout the region.
Right. I mean, and going back to tourism and travel patterns, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of China, right? I mean, Chinese tourists make up the bulk of foreign tourists that come to South Korea and a lot of other Asian countries. So you have less of these Chinese people coming, and the tourism industry is hard hit. And the South Korean government is trying to do all sorts of things like discounts, visa waivers to get people to come back.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was interesting to watch. I mean, and also just from a story of people, quote unquote, losing their minds over Ebola fears and over MERS fears to the point where, okay, we're going to cancel school for 2 weeks in South Korea because of MERS, even though the chance of you getting it is next to nothing, or banning, air quotes again, Africans from going into certain restaurants or bars because of Ebola being from Africa, even though people in South Korea, who are South African and white have no problem going into a bar. But if you happen to have darker skin, you then can't go into a bar because you're perceived to have coming from an Ebola infected area.
Right. I mean, there's definitely exaggerated hysteria surrounding any sort of outbreak or epidemic, right? And a lot of the times it comes from being uninformed. And I think the Korean government's stance in the beginning of the MERS outbreak did not help this hysteria because they were opaque.
Right. They kept the hospitals' names out of the news. And I almost want to say that given South Korea's unique stance on what defamation is, that may have also played into it, because in South Korea, if information is factually true, you can still be tried for defamation. So if the South Korean government released the information, there could have been a situation where those hospitals could have come back and sued the government for defamation for releasing true information that would have effectively harmed their businesses.
Right. And it's like you ask yourself, are there priorities in order? I mean, what is more important, the health and well-being of the public or these hospitals' reputation?
Right.
It's a rhetorical question.
Right. Yeah. Moving on to another of one of my stories, and that has been human rights in the region. Specifically, like, say, Rohingyas, the Uyghurs up in Xinjiang, North Korean human rights issues coming up on 2 years after the COI, and, of course, the story that was broken late in 2014, but there's still a lawsuit in South Korea right now, the disabled individuals who were essentially slaves down in the salt farms in the southern region of South Korea.
Right. That was earlier.
Yeah, it was late 2014, but now those individuals are suing the government because of complacency issues.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if you look at the stateless stateless nature of the Rohingyas and the swarms of people in the South China Sea this summer, thousands and thousands being kept off the coast of Indonesia and Thailand, it really shows how much further human rights need to be developed in the Asia-Pacific region.
Right.
And then other things on your list?
That was it for me.
Oh, okay. Well, I have one more, and kind of goes back to China again, and that is the Chinese hack on the Office of Personnel Management that was released earlier this year in the United States. So once more showing that China kind of does what it wants, even though this past week China finally admitted that someone from within its borders carried out that attack. But as we have typically seen in the past, no matter who carries out the attack against a foreign entity in China, they tend to reap the benefits at a state level, as we saw with the parade and all the military hardware that was gleaned from others' intellectual property.
Right. Yeah. I think the big theme of this podcast is like top Pacific stories, top China stories.
Well, China's the biggest player in the region.
Yeah. Yep. In the world.
In the world. At least this part of the world. Anyway, Haydon, thank you so much for joining me this week on the podcast.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And now to take a closer look at headlines shaping the region. The arrival of the naval carrier cemented air power as a dominating force in military operations. As China continues to reclaim more land from the ocean floor in the South China Sea and develop what it calls humanitarian and defensive outposts, but could equally be forward military installations, attention is usually placed on the number of ports, not airstrips. China has one working runway on the Woody Reef located in the Paracel Island chain, with at least 2 or 3 more in development in the Spratlys. Yuan Graham, Director of International Security Program at the Lowry Institute in Sydney, Australia, says these bases could actually shift the balance of local power, noting that intimidation from air power may have a considerable effect and could possibly lead to a declaration of a South China Sea air defense zone, which, in all reality, isn't outside the realm of possibilities, as Beijing has previously declared one over the East China Sea. Could it be that while the world has sought to play diplomacy, it simply ended up giving China enough time to dig in to the point where Beijing cannot be removed from its new bases without force? Regardless of court rulings and pressure, it may be virtually impossible to extricate China from the areas of contention. So when news of the United States deploying P-8 Poseidon spy planes in Singapore came about, I'm pretty much left with just a meh response. I mean, the United States has made this move to up the ante and monitor Beijing's activity in the South China Sea. The planes will be operating out of the island city-state between December 7th and December 14th, with further deployments expected in the future. But let's face it, any challenge to Beijing's authority elicits a rebuke. The United States says this will promote greater interoperability with regional militaries through participation in bilateral and multilateral exercises, while providing timely support for regional humanitarian and disaster relief and maritime security efforts. However, in reality, nothing is going to change or happen. Want more proof that the world has simply had enough of Beijing's claims in the South China Sea? Well, try this one on for size. Italy has come out in support of the Philippines' attempt to resolve its territorial dispute by way of the International Court of Arbitration. Italian President Sergio Mattarella supported the Philippines' adherence to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas in upholding freedom of navigation, acknowledging that the Philippines has taken an appropriate path to a peaceful dispute resolution. A Vietnamese student and his friend have been sentenced to 6 months in prison for Facebook posts that advise drivers how to evade temporary traffic checkpoints in the northern city of Hai Phong in Vietnam. The court found the pair guilty of illegally circulating information on the internet. A lawyer familiar with the case calls the conviction a risky move, and that the pair were simply expressing their views, noting that convicting them for the posts set a dangerous precedent and might violate their freedom of speech. Authorities say the 20-somethings were spreading defamatory content and tarnishing the image of police. But some residents say the posts exposed wrongdoing and helped people avoid traffic police who often hid in unexpected places to catch and find violators. The former managing editor of the Tana Nen daily newspaper said the social network is having a great impact on the Southeast Asian nation, where the press just happens to be under the government's control. And that is what this is really about, for Reporters Without Borders has dubbed Vietnam the enemy of the internet for its online censorship and surveillance programs. Thailand's junta blocked an anti-corruption protest on Monday of this week, detaining about 36 students and other activists who were on their way to a park to honor past kings. The authorities detached a railway car carrying the protesters to Rajabaki Park near Hua Hin before taking them into custody. Officials then conveniently announced that the park, which happened to be on Army land, was closed for the day for renovations. The incident is sparking some controversy in Thailand since the park was an Army-related project, and leaking details related to Army projects is rare. Some feel it may actually signal a rift in the fabric of the junta, or at least an attempt to discredit some at the very top, as 2 officials associated with the project have been accused of receiving kickbacks. If this is truly an attempt to unravel the junta, will we see more documents being released and implicating corrupt officials? And if that is the case, will that force junta leader Prayut Chan-o-cha to crack down harder and cast aside even more civil liberties to preserve the so-called order? And that certainly appears to be the case, as Prayut has come out and defended the military's actions, saying, quote, "You know why you were not allowed to go to Rajabaki Park? Because there were people waiting to beat you. If we let them go, they would have been beaten. If they died or were injured, the government would have been blamed again." End quote. Now, video footage does show ultra-nationalist demonstrators gathering at the park where the students had been stopped. However, the soldiers made absolutely no attempt to arrest or disperse that angry crowd, instead focusing on the group that could actually make the military look bad. Roughly 14,000 people assembled in downtown Seoul on Saturday, December 5th, demanding that South Korean President Park Geun-hye apologize for her heavy-handed tactics in dealing with a similar protest 2 weeks ago. The government had sought to declare the rally illegal, but the protesters took the matter to court and won a repeal. The protests also revisited issues addressed last time, like Park's plan to control history textbooks, labor reforms that she wishes to enact, and more. Many of the protesters arrived at the venue wearing masquerade ball masks and other fun, if not comical, masks to make fun of Park's comparison to protesters and ISIS. The protests were peaceful, with many bringing flowers to the event. But you know what? The story doesn't end there. Han Sang-kyung, the head of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, is wanted by authorities for his role in organizing the November 14th protests. Now, since the 16th, he's actually been held up in Choge Temple, Choge-sa, seeking sanctuary inside the Buddhist facility. However, the Choge order has asked Han to leave multiple times, but he's merely refused to do so. Now, currently, some 2,000 police officers have surrounded the temple, cutting off any and all escape routes, and have actually been threatening to storm the facilities and forcibly remove him. But the monks inside have protested, saying that if the police did so, it would essentially be a breakdown in civil order. Now, there does seem to be a bit of a reprieve, because as of this recording, police have given Mr. Han until later on Thursday to give himself up. Han had previously said he would do so if the labor reform bills that are currently in Parliament were stymied, were killed. And since they weren't passed this week, they're essentially dead in the water, meaning it could set up the exact conditions necessary to allow Han to walk out and face the charges against him. This issue goes beyond Mr. Han, with the police contemplating charging the union with sedition, which according to Yi Ho-jung, a professor at Sogang University, is a crime that refers to endangering the peace of a particular area. And for this charge to be brought about, there actually needs to be rioting that results in arson and looting of private establishments. What all this really seems to be is yet another heavy-handed attempt by the PAC administration to bring opponents under control through fear and intimidation. That's it for all the news this week, but one more time for this year, let's take a quick look at some of your comments. On a Japanese court throwing out a lawsuit filed against the Prime Minister for releasing false information, Twitter user @Whirlpool said, "Watching the report on this outrageous decision, I felt new fear for democracy in Japan." On the United States, South Korea and Japan meeting to discuss North Korea's nuclear program, Twitter user @Phoenix787 said, "I feel both Japan and South Korea are more concerned about their egos than North Korea." On the bombing in Bangladesh, Edgar Rosario said, "The disregard for human life for the last couple of months makes me lose hope. But in my heart, I know the good outweighs the evil in people's hearts." Yellow Drug left this comment on our North Korean Human Rights podcast. "Thank you, Steve, for bringing us this wonderful interview. I think at least given the fact how little we've been involving ourselves with the DPRK issue, I say it's a right step to take. Not to diminish people working so hard to bring justice and make things better, but it is no secret we as a whole have been not really attentive to the issues." And finally, Victor Stammer on Abe's plan not to call election in both of Japan's houses of parliament. "For once, I agree with Abe. I see no reason why they should hold the election 2 years earlier. Well, except for the fact that reinterpreting the Constitution should be reason enough for an earlier election." As always, those are some awesome comments, and I truly appreciate the time it took everyone to send in a comment, not only this week, but this year. This part of the podcast doesn't work without you, so thank you. Thank you so much again. Now, don't forget, if you ever want to record a message, you can do so on your phone or on your home computer and send that in as well. Well, that'll do it for me this week and this year. So if you enjoyed the podcast, do me a favor and please share it with your friends. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you, which will be in February. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can continue to keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, if you have any comments, any questions, any feedback, I want to hear from you. Please drop me a line at podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for listening. I am Steve Miller, and until next time, be true to yourself and always be awesome.